Okay, so today we are going to talk about the background to the Reformation. It is the first in my series on modern church history, and for the past 2 years, I've been going over the early church history and then medieval church history. And so this year we come now to modern church history. I will take more than 1 year to go over all of it. And this year is the first lesson on the background to the Reformation. So as you may probably guess, the era of modern church history begins with the Protestant Reformation. And this is what we are going to do today. I'm going to touch very briefly on what the Reformation was. We're going to look at what's the movement itself and who are the Protestant traditions that came out of it. Then we're going to look at the intellectual background of the Reformation. We are going to consider the movement known as the Renaissance and Renaissance humanism. We're going to look at a few important people associated with this movement and the background to the Reformation. Then we will look at the spiritual background to the Reformation, the condition of the Roman Catholic Church in the generation just before the Reformation. We're going to look at aspects of the abuse and corruption going on within the Roman Church. And we're also going to take a bit of a look at what medieval piety looks like in the days of the Reformation. Finally, we will look at some forerunners of the Reformation. We're going to consider the movement of the, you should say Waldensians, the Waldensians. Look at this character, Girolamo Savonarola, and we're going to review Wycliffe and Huss, which was covered last year. Right. So as strange as it may be for me to talk about what is the Reformation in a Reformed church, I am going to talk a bit about that. And so the movement itself, Reformation, it happened in the Western church. And if you have been around in my medieval church history lessons, you would see you would have seen this map before, where we see the whole world of the Christian world at the time of the 11th century, was divided into the eastern side and the western side, and they separated in the schism, the Great Schism of 1054. In 1054 AD, the East and the Pope excommunicated the entire Eastern Orthodox Christendom, and the Patriarch in Constantinople returned the favor, and so both of them diverged at that point, and so you can see here Western Christianity covers Western Europe, and you can see here there's Italy, there's Rome. Rome is inside Western Christianity. There's the other countries in Western Europe, France, Britain, there's Germany, Switzerland, all that. Okay? And Eastern Orthodox, right? That's where the Greek-speaking Christians are. So there's Eastern Europe, Turkey, Greece. Okay? And so that split happened in 1054, and now down to around the 16th century, they are of course still apart, and the Reformation was a religious and ecclesiastical movement in the Western church. So it happened in the west side of that map that I was showing you, and it ultimately resulted in the destruction of the authority of the Roman Pope over a large portion of Western Christianity, and of course resulted in the setting up of Protestant churches. And when it happened, it's seen as starting proper in 1517, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses on the door of Castle Church in Wittenberg on the 31st of October. That is seen as sparking the start of the Protestant Reformation. So you have seen this little chart that I showed in my lesson on the schism as well. So there was that, if you can see, all of Christendom divided into Western Christianity and the Eastern Orthodox Church. By the way, the church that is just in front of FERC, the Syrian Orthodox Church belongs to, they're under Eastern Orthodox. Okay, and Western Christianity, after the Reformation, is further split between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. So where are we? We are, okay, I'm not annotating, but we are in the box of Protestantism. We are over here. Okay. And the traditions that have come out of the Protestant Reformation. So who are these? So all of these groups can trace their origin back to the Reformation. Now, the earliest three streams that came out of the Roman Church were actually the Lutheran, Reformed, and Anabaptist. So these are the three main streams that first came out of Rome. And out of all these, we have the various Protestant traditions that we know today. So Anglicanism, the Baptist tradition, Methodist, etc. Okay, so these are the Protestant traditions. We consider the intellectual background for the Reformation. First, we talk about the Renaissance. Okay, so what is the Renaissance? Okay, the Renaissance is a word meaning rebirth or regeneration. It was an intellectual and cultural movement in Western Europe beginning around the middle of the 14th century and lasting well into the 16th century as well. And it was characterized by a revival of interest in classical Greek and Roman literature. Okay, so the classical Greek and Roman literature, right, referring to literature from the ancient era, right? Maybe first century or before. You know, you think of Plato, Cicero, Horace, Homer. Yeah, so these classical Greek texts. Now, yeah, you have to remember that the Western Church, right? The Western Church was Latin speaking, right? Of course, the Eastern Church could speak Greek very well, and of course knew of the Greek classics, right, for a long time already. But after some time, interest and maybe access to these literature waned in Western Europe, and it saw a revival in the time of the Renaissance. And it was not merely an intellectual movement; it was a cultural movement as well that affected not just philosophy, but poetry, art, music, architecture. All these were all changed in the movement of the Renaissance. And one of the intellectual currents that will be quite important, right, as a background to the Reformation is humanism, meaning the study of humanity. Now, the word humanism today may raise some negative connotations, but in the time of the Renaissance, this humanism isn't the same as the crude secular humanism we think of today, considering man as master of the universe and without God, right? This humanism was a study of the human condition, and not necessarily in complete isolation from God. In fact, it was man in relation to God that was also studied. Renaissance and individualism, right? The Renaissance also brought about brought about an increase in individual expression, right, through art, poetry, and literature, and so on. And is of course characterized by a focus on the human individual, the human as an individual, a unique person. And Schaff, in his History of the Christian Church, says the taproot of the Renaissance was individualism as opposed to sacerdotal authority. Right? Sacerdotalism is something I will describe later on as well. But briefly, it is about sacerdotal authority is about the authority of the church and its officers and its control over all aspects of human life and experience. Another aspect of the Renaissance was how it emphasized the importance of and value of life on earth. Now, what did piety look like in the medieval times before the Renaissance? Okay? Basically, only the life to come is important, and your life here on this earth, right, is only important insofar as it prepares you for the life to come. And this world, right, is this world and this life is just full of evil, and you have these great monastic movements in which they retreat from the world. They live ascetic and Spartan lifestyles with a high and holy contempt for beauty and this life, right? Only contemplating, right? Contemplating only the life to come. And monasticism is an aspect of Roman religion that the Christian humanists will viciously attack. So Renaissance humanism emphasized the beauty and value of this life on earth. And again, I will remind you that it's not a crude secularism with no consideration of the life to come, right? The humanists were still Christian humanists, but they emphasize that there is beauty and there is value, right, in this life and in this world, and it is a good thing to cultivate, right? To cultivate the things of this world as well, right? Art, music, literature. So from Nick Needham, Renaissance humanists looked back on this ancient civilization of Greece and Rome as the golden age of human culture, the perfect expression of the human spirit and its highest values. This golden age, they believed, must be reborn in the present if humankind was to fulfill its true potential. There was an awakening of interest in humanity itself and the human world, a fresh and excited optimism about the possibilities of human achievement in art, music, literature, education, science, and government. This brought with it a reaction against the monastic ideal of poverty, asceticism, and heavenly contemplation in favor of an active and productive life in the world through secular pursuits, from the Latin secular meaning this present age. Renaissance thinkers began to glorify the secular realm of the state, politics, city life, even war as the true sphere for human action. From Schaff, after having been taught for centuries that the literature of classic antiquity was full of snares and dangers for a Christian public, men opened their eyes and reveled with childlike delight in the discovery of ancient authors and history. Virgil sang again in the Aeneid, Homer the Iliad, and Odyssey. Cicero once more delivered his orations, and Plato taught his philosophy. It was indeed an intellectual and artistic new birth that burst forth in Italy, a regeneration as the word Renaissance means. But it was more. It was a revolt against monastic asceticism and scholasticism, the systems which cramped the free flow of bodily enthusiasm and intellectual inquiry. It called men from morbid self-mortifications as the most fitting discipline of mortal existence here below, and offered him the satisfaction of all the elements of his nature as his proper pursuit. So you can see in these two quotations the spirit, right, of Renaissance humanism. And one thing that came out of the Renaissance that is very important as a background for the Reformation is the flourishing of the study of the Greek language in the Western Church. Okay, so interest in Greek classics naturally fueled a study of the Greek language, and so universities and popes also even began to fund, right, the teaching of Greek, and people came over from the eastern side, came over to the western side and started teaching and were teaching Greek. And so the study of Greek in the Western Church underwent a revival, where previously the attitude towards Greek, it was hinted a bit in the quote from Asaph, was that in the Western Church was that you study Greek, it will lead you into all sorts of heresy, which is funny. I know it's funny considering the New Testament was written in Greek, but a lot of the early church heretics came from the East, so which is the Greek-speaking side, right? But here in the Renaissance movement, the study of Greek saw a revival, and in addition to the pagan Greek authors such as Plato and Aristotle, the church fathers, right, the church fathers who wrote in Greek, right, these were studied too. And of course, some of them were studying the Greek fathers and realizing that the Christianity that they described, the simplicity of it was so different from the whole machinery of the Roman Church that they were in. And so there was this increase in the knowledge of Greek in the Western Church that will of course become very important later. We'll look at a few important people in the Renaissance. These are not all the important people. There are just too many to list. I'll just list a handful of them. Right, Lorenzo Valla, Jacques Lefebvre, and Erasmus of Rotterdam, also known as Desiderius Erasmus. First, Lorenzo Valla. These are his years here, 1406 to 1457. And the most famous thing that he did was that he employed techniques, right, that should I say precursors to modern textual criticism, to expose this document known as the Donation of Constantine as a forgery. Now, what was this thing called the Donation of Constantine? Okay, if you remember in my early church lessons, there was Constantine, the Christian emperor in the 4th century AD. So he was the first Christian emperor of the Roman Empire who laid the groundwork towards Christianity becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire. And this document called the Donation of Constantine was a document that seems to have appeared much later than the time of Constantine, which seems to state that Constantine had donated some large amounts of land and properties to the Bishop of Rome as the church's perpetual possession. And this donation of Constantine was used by the papacy to press claims on for many years, and as a sort of symbol of their authority. And Lorenzo Valla, employing techniques of textual criticism, like looking at the language in that document and saying, hey, this language actually doesn't fit with the language of the time of the 4th century, or that he exposed this document to be a forgery. Of course, the popes were not too pleased about that, and Valla also called for the papacy to renounce their claim over their holdings, the vast holdings that they have. That and also many other anti-papal writings as well. against the papacy. Jacques Lefebvre. His dates are here, 1460 to 1533. If you notice, it actually overlaps with Martin Luther's the start of his Reformation, right? He worked on a French translation of the Bible, completed in many stages. First, New Testament, then Psalms, then rest of the Old Testament. In fact, he also had this work on the Psalms that was very important, and he emphasized a grammatical historical method of interpretation, as opposed to the fanciful analogical interpretation that was common in the medieval church of that day, coming up with assigning various fanciful meanings to entities, words, and objects in the text. He emphasized looking at it grammatically, right? What do the words actually mean, and what does it mean? What did it mean then in that historical period? So he emphasized that method of interpretation, and according to some sources, he also did teach justification by faith and not by merit, even though, of course, he never did work out all the implications of that. In fact, he was later accused of Lutheranism, right? As you can see, his dates are post 15. He lived past 1517 as well, and therefore got to see the start of the Reformation. He was accused of being a follower of Luther, and Lefebvre. Of course, okay, I didn't mention that he was in Paris, right? Because you see his French name here, and he influenced William Farel among other French reformers, right? This William Farel eventually went to Geneva, and he's the one who recruited John Calvin into Geneva to get the movement of reform going. And now we come to Desiderius Erasmus, who is an extremely important character in this whole, not just in this lesson in the Renaissance period, but in all of church history as well. He is one of the most important thinkers in the Western Church, and there's so much, of course, to talk about his writings and ideas, but we only talk about a few of it. So here his dates 1466 to 1536. He would in fact go into a written debate against Martin Luther, which resulted in Luther's great work, The Bondage of the Will. While Erasmus was eventually an opponent to the Reformation, right? He also saw through many of the inconsistencies, absurdities, and outright blasphemies of the Roman Catholic piety, and he attacked many aspects of it and the scholastic theology, the way that they were doing theology at that time as well. And critically important to the Reformation, right, was that he published his own edition of the Greek New Testament. Okay, so the Bible in the Western Church, the approved Bible version in the Western Church at the time was the Latin Vulgate, right, which is the Latin translation from Jerome, right, the early church father, right, translation out of the Greek and Hebrew into Latin, and that was held to be like the perfect Bible, the perfect Bible translation, and yeah, so Latin Vulgate was the standard, the Bible, but Erasmus got together the Greek manuscripts that they had at that time, right, and and studied them and found as best as he could what the original Greek New Testament said based on the manuscripts, and he published an edition, right, of the Greek New Testament, the first ever Greek New Testament to be printed, because in his time the printing press was around, right? And this is the Greek New Testament which Luther used heavily in his study of the New Testament. Now, here a quote here from Erasmus. The Son itself is not more common and open to everyone than the teaching of Christ is. I utterly disagree with those who do not want the Holy Scriptures to be translated into the native tongue and read by ordinary people, as if Christ's teaching was so complicated that only a few theologians could understand it, or as if the strength of the Christian faith were found in people's ignorance of it. It may be wise to conceal the mysteries of kingly government from ordinary folk, but Christ wanted his mysteries to be proclaimed as openly as possible. I want even the lowliest woman to read the Gospels and the letters of St. Paul. I want them to be translated into all languages so that they can be read and understood by Scots and Irishmen, by Turks and Muslims. To make people understand what Christianity teaches is surely the first step to converting them. Perhaps many will mock the scriptures, but some will take them to heart. I greatly desire that the farm worker should sing parts of scripture to himself as he follows his plow, that the weaver should hum them to the tune of his shuttle, that the traveler should banish the boredom of his journey by reading Bible stories. Let the conversations of all Christians flow from scripture, for our everyday conversations generally reveal what we are. Now, this sounds very Protestant, doesn't it? Right? We think of it when he said, I greatly desire that the farm worker should sing parts of scripture to himself as he follows his plow. I could not help but think of that similar quote from William Tyndale, right, who risked his life to translate the Bible from the original languages into English, right? As he said, if the Lord should preserve me, I will make the boy who pushes, right, the plow, who follows the plow, know the scriptures better than that priest that he was arguing with. So that was Erasmus. And now we come to the spiritual background for the Reformation. Okay, the background picture here is a result of a Google image search on indulgences, the selling of indulgences. More on that later. Okay, so we'll talk about aspects of abuse and corruption in the Roman Church in the days just before the Reformation. We have absolute papal authority. So the Pope, right, the Bishop of Rome, was seen to be Christ's representative on earth, and whatever he said when he was in ex cathedra, whatever he says ex cathedra, it's a kind of declaration from the Pope, is taken to be infallible, right? The Pope can issue decrees, right? Can declare anyone excommunicated, can even declare whole nations or cities excommunicated, right? He could of course absolve people of their sins, just as other bishops in the Roman Church could, right? So there was absolute papal authority, right? The Pope's authority was held to be absolute. The Pope was infallible. There was also immoral clergy, right? Clergy, as in the priests, the bishops of the Roman Church, right? And they were known to be very corrupt, such that even the common people in Western Europe at the time also could laugh at how corrupt their church officers were. And there was of course buying and selling of clerical office. There was a lot of fornication among the clergy, and this was of course due in large part to the requirement of clerical celibacy. right? Priests and bishops were not allowed to be married, and yet it is also commonly known that they had concubines and they had children, such that even councils had to make provisions, right, for the concubines and children of priests, right? And many also took up various parishes and bishoprics, right, in many different places. Like for example, an Italian bishop could be over the see of could be in charge of the see some see in England, and he could never even set foot in England, so people wouldn't even see their own bishop, right? And not just immorality, there was also ignorance on the part of the clergy as well. So they would say the mass, right, in Latin, but many of them didn't even understand Latin as well, and they would just say the lines. And so the clergy also are uneducated in any sort of theology. Also, they could not, of course, lead the people. And there was also the sale of indulgences, which I will go into in more detail. Indulgences. Now, what is an indulgence? So an indulgence is defined. Even today, the institution of indulgence is there in the Roman Catholic Church. It says the remission of the temporal punishment due to God for sins already forgiven as to guilt, a remission granted by ecclesiastical authority to the faithful from the treasury of the superabundant satisfactory merits of our Lord Jesus Christ, of Mary Most Holy, and of the saints. Okay, so what is it exactly? So to talk about what indulgences are, we need to have a bit of an understanding of the system in the Roman Church. So indulgences were part of the penance system. So you may be familiar with how Roman Catholics have to go to the priest for confession, and the institution of penance began as an institution in the church for readmitting those who had lapsed or who were formerly excommunicated back into the church, right, back into the communion of the church. But before that, they had to do penance, which may have been some good works that were prescribed to him by the bishop, such that he could demonstrate his repentance. And penance then grew into something for the common Christian as well, right? As they confess their sins, and then the priest assigns them penance, maybe some good works that they have to do, some alms they had to give, perform some service for the church. And indulgences came in as sort of a way to relax some requirements of a particular load of penance, which when it first started out was not very common, right? Didn't really involve money, and it was for the priest to bestow, right? So an indulgence, you don't need to do as much penance. And over time, it became increasingly commercialized, such that you could now popes were using it to raise money, right? And you could buy and sell indulgences, and it came to a point where you could also purchase indulgences for the dead in purgatory, right? So Roman Catholic doctrine holds that those who die, unless you are really very holy, you go to purgatory, where you experience some form of penal consequences for your sins on earth before you are finally allowed to go to heaven. So the time in purgatory could be really very, very long, right? Years or maybe hundreds of years, and you could like purchase for your dead relative time off from purgatory by buying an indulgence. Now, of course, this such a practice, right, was not such commercializing of indulgences was not met with would have met with some raised eyebrows and definitely some voices in the church criticize that practice and raise some objections and very serious reservations concerning this. And one of them was again our friend Erasmus. Okay, he says, "What shall I say of such as cry up and maintain the cheat of pardons and indulgences, that by these compute the time of each soul's residence in purgatory, and assign them a longer or shorter continuance, according as they purchase more or fewer of these paltry pardons and saleable exemptions? By this easy way of purchasing pardons, any notorious highwayman, any plundering soldier, or any bribe-taking judge shall disperse some part of their unjust gains, and so think all their grossest impiety sufficiently atoned for. So many perjuries, lusts, drunkenness, quarrels, bloodsheds, cheats, treacheries, and all sorts of debaucheries shall all be, as it were, struck a bargain for, and such a contract made as if they had paid off all arrears and might now begin upon a new score." Okay, so this is from Erasmus's work in Praise of Folly, which is a grand satirical piece, poking fun at among other things, medieval the religion of his day. Right? I recommend you go and read it. I'll be quoting more from it later. We'll now look at what medieval piety looked like. And first, sacerdotalism, which is an emphasis on the person of the priest or bishop and the dependence on him and his administration of the sacraments for the good of your soul, right? So it all depends on him and on the external sacraments, the rites that the rituals and rites that you go through, right? The picture of medieval piety, it can be thought of as like this water flowing through taps progressively down the pipe at different stages, and at the very top is the Pope, that big tap. The Pope, from him flows all the grace, right? And then down maybe through the cardinals and the bishops, and then the taps are and then the smallest taps, right, down right to the people are the 7 sacraments that these higher taps administer, right? The sacraments, the mass, matrimony, last rites, ordination, right? Baptism, right, communion, and so on, right? So that was sacerdotalism, right? All you had to do was just stand under these taps and let the taps flow down to you. You just need to go to the mass, say the prayers, do your penance, right? And yes, it was mechanical, and again, that mechanical aspect of it did not meet with uncritical acceptance from all theologians either. Okay. So there was also rife superstition, right? Image worship, worshipping and touching of relics that were supposedly associated with saints, the great pantheon of patron saints that they prayed to, right? And of course the greatest of all, the Virgin Mary, right? And the worship, right? Sort of related to the first point earlier about sacerdotalism, right? Was the mass. It was the worship in the Roman Church was very, very elaborate, right? Far removed from the ancient simplicity of the early church, right? Lots of bells and whistles, and it was a grand feast for the senses for the people who attended this worship, and of course they were none the wiser about what was actually going on or what was supposed to be represented by the elements in the worship. And at the center of everyday Roman religion was the mass, right, where the priest would say the prayer of consecration, which would turn the bread and the wine into, also they speak, into the literal body and blood of Christ, right, by what they call transubstantiation. And this is again a point that the reformers will attack. Right, so that was medieval piety, and we will go back to our dear friend Erasmus and see as he treasures medieval religion. All these quotes are taken from the book In Praise of Folly that I quoted earlier. Okay, on patron saints, each saint has his distinct office allotted to him, and is accordingly addressed to upon the respective occasions, as one for the toothache, a second to grant an easy delivery in childbirth, a third to help persons to lost goods, another to protect seamen in a long voyage, a fifth to guard the farmer's cows and sheep, and so on. For to rehearse all instances would be extremely tedious. On preaching, our souls are so fashioned and molded that they are sooner captivated by appearances than by real truths, of which if anyone would demand an example, he may find a very familiar one in churches, where if what is delivered from the pulpit be a grave, solid, rational discourse, all the congregation would grow weary and fall asleep till their patience be released. Whereas if the preacher be zealous in his thumbs of the cushion, antic gestures, and spend his glass in the telling of pleasant stories, right? Spend his glass means the hourglass for preaching. His beloved shall then stand up, tuck their hair behind their ears, and be very devoutly attentive. Okay. Lastly, on veneration of on veneration of Mary, how many zealous votaries are there that pay so profound respect to the Virgin Mary as to place lighted tapers even at noonday upon her altars? And yet how few of them copy after her untouched chastity, her modesty, and her other commendable virtues, in the imitation whereof consists the truest esteem of divine worship. Lastly, on images, the unwary supplicants seldom distinguish betwixt the things themselves and the objects they represent. That is to say, he says that they are worshipping images. Okay. So amidst all this abuse and corruption, there's also what perhaps positive developments, right? Increase in preaching. Actually, people did see importance in preaching, and various efforts were made to reform preaching, right, to varying degrees of success. Various efforts at moral reform, right, various movements aiming for reform, and there was also religious zeal. Michael Reeves, in his book The Unquenchable Flame, right, states that the historical research actually shows that in the generation before the Reformation, religion was very popular. You know, more masses, more churches, right, more statues of the saints, right, even books for those who could read, right, Christian books, and they were always hungry for reform. But this is again what sets the Reformation apart from these movements of reform. Here in the last bit, such were most Christians on the eve of the Reformation, devoted to the improvement, but not the overthrow of their religion. Now I'll just briefly talk about some forerunners of the Reformation. Talk about the Waldensians. They are a group around the 12th century. It's a movement formed around Peter Waldo. It's uncertain whether he actually founded this movement, but this merchant in Lyon, in France, sold his goods and gave to the poor. His followers traveled and preached, and it's known that they held a number of doctrines in agreement with Protestant reformers. They endured bloody persecutions at the hands of the Roman Church, and for some of them, they were absorbed into the Reformed Church after the Reformed Christians actually sought them out, right? Because they were hiding in the mountains and the valleys in response to the persecution, right? But there's still a distinct Waldensian church today. Interesting character, Jerome Savonarola, right? As a monk of the Dominican order, he rose to prominence in Florence, Italy, due to the eloquence of his preaching, and he in fact became a de facto leader of the city. So he also pursued moral reform in Florence. Right? Unfortunately, he was also given to claim visions and prophecies and say that God was speaking to him, in prophecies, and he was eventually burned at the stake as a heretic, right? So here's a quote from him, criticizing the preachers of his day, right? Content with the receipt of revenue, they preach to please princes and to be praised by them, right? And here another quote from his preaching, right? It is untrue that God's grace is obtained by pre-existing works of merit as though works and deserts were the cause of predestination. Right? Confess that not by your own merits have ye obtained salvation, but by the goodness of God. Again, sounds very Protestant. And finally, right, we have Wycliffe and Huss, which I covered in the previous lesson. Right, John Wycliffe in the 14th century England, right, pushed back against the papacy's encroachment on England. He is known for having written against transubstantiation and various other practices of the Roman Church and the doctrine as well. Right, his followers are known as Lollards, right, who went around preaching the gospel as well, and he translated the Bible into English from the Latin Vulgate. Okay. And we also have John Huss, right, who was a reformer in Bohemia. He was influenced by Wycliffe, and he also made various efforts of reform in Bohemia, but he was eventually tried and executed by the papacy, burned at the stake at the sentence of the Council of Constance in 1415. Now, something ties, right, all these movements together as they gravitate towards the great Protestant Reformation. In all these and similar movements, the impulse was manifesting itself in favor of a more spiritual conception of Christianity, of the devotional as opposed to the sacramental view, of the individualistic as opposed to the hierarchical, and in favor of the immediate communion of all Christians with God, apart from the sacerdotal aid of the priesthood. Right, so in conclusion, right, we've covered today what the Reformation is. We've considered briefly touched on what the movement was and the Protestant traditions that came out of it. Right, we talked about the intellectual background. We looked at Renaissance humanism, right, how they emphasize the individual, the beauty of this life, the value of this life, and also the flourishing of study of Greek. There's some important people, right? I remember Erasmus, whose Greek New Testament was very critical for Luther. We looked at the spiritual background, the abuse and corruption, particularly the sale of indulgences that we looked at in more detail, right? And medieval piety, there was the good, the bad, and the ugly, efforts at reform, but none of it of the character of a complete overthrow of Roman religion like the Reformation. So some forerunners of the Reformation, we had the Waldenses, and we had Savonarola, and we looked at Wycliffe and Huss, who was that I covered in the lesson last year. Okay, so this is all I have for today.